Welcome to Chatsunami. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Chatsunami. My name's Satsunami and joining me today from the absolutely fantastic tabletop RPG Eureka, Investigative Urban Fantasy is none other than the creators themselves, Addison and Ash. Welcome both of you. How are you doing tonight?
Hello, I'm Addison from the Agency of Narrative, Intrigue, and Mystery, or ANIM, creators of Eureka, Investigative Urban Fantasy. Our team is about 7-8 people. Got 2 of us on today, and the other one is Ash.
Yeah, I'm Ash. I'm the editor. One of the original writers who actually came up with the concept is not here today, but you've at least got the lead writer and the editor.
What a great combo, to be fair. This is an absolutely fantastic tabletop RPG. And before we dive into what makes it great and what makes it so unique, I've got to ask, what led you to this point? What was the inspiration to work on something like this? Because I was giving a very thorough read of your guidebook for this, and it's an absolutely compelling read, by the way. And I'm not just saying that because you're both on, but what was the inspiration behind starting work on this?
No one else had done it.
Which is kind of unbelievable.
Yeah. So we like tabletop RPGs. This idea started in 2020, 2021, maybe. It kind of started with Brandon a little earlier than that. I joined the team in December or January, like 2021 to 2022. And of course, I've played tabletop RPGs with Brandon. He's one of the other writers for a long time. And so a lot of the overlap of what we wanted was a tabletop RPG that is about mystery investigation, where the player characters solve mysteries, not necessarily as police detectives, but as, off the top of my head, like Scooby-Doo. And that really didn't exist in a way that we were satisfied with before Eureka.
There had been attempts at it, right? Because you have your Call of Cthulhu's and your Gumshoe, but Eureka, and particularly the central system, the Eureka system that I'm sure we'll talk about later, came about from Brandon's own frustration with running Trail of Cthulhu, which is a Gumshoe adaptation of Call of Cthulhu, and just finding it not equipped to handle mysteries in a way that was really resonant with the genre or worked well in the medium of tabletop games.
We're going to probably get to this later in the discussion, but the medium, the artistic medium and like technology, you might say, of tabletop RPGs it's about 50 years old now, but so are video games. Video games are also about a 50-ish year old artistic medium / technology. And if you look at how far video games have advanced, not just in like, the graphics are better now, although that is something that, a lot of people put a lot of work into getting more polygons on screen without destroying the computer. If you compare how much both game design, game programming has advanced and what video game developers have learned about what makes a video game more fun and what makes it less fun and what makes it run better, what makes it not run better, and you compare that to tabletop RPGs, even though they're both 50 years old, tabletop RPGs as a technology are just absolutely super stagnant by comparison. And I think there's a few reasons for that. The Gumshoe system was probably the first big attempt at an advancement in trying to run that kind of gameplay in a tabletop RPG. And that was, when did Gumshoe come out? Like 2009 or something?
Something like that.
Fairly recent. And before that, all you really had was Call of Cthulhu. And of course, all right, I'm also skipping over probably 50 indie games that just never made it out of the group that made them. And Call of Cthulhu, while it was the best thing around for that, it's based off of RuneQuest, which is a dungeon crawling game. And once you know that, you really can't unsee it, because Call of Cthulhu gameplay and Call of Cthulhu modules work a lot like dungeon crawls, and really did not advance, even in 7 editions, really did not advance the investigation part of the gameplay. And I think Gumshoe also has its issues with that. But Call of Cthulhu has been around for at least like 40 years. So the medium is fairly stagnant and does not advance quickly. And there's not a lot of people making these real innovations in it. And so the gameplay we wanted, where the player characters solve mysteries and by looking at clues, it didn't really exist. The closest thing was Gumshoe, and we weren't really satisfied with Gumshoe.
Yeah, I joined the project a lot later, and I've been looking for a good mystery RPG for, years, really. I thought that Gumshoe had a lot that sparked my imagination that I liked, liked, but I still wasn't fully satisfied with it. So when I came across Eureka very early in its public release, I really immediately thought this was a real diamond in the rough and just wanted to spend as much time as I could polishing it. So I'm very grateful to be on the team and be able to refine it into something that I hope speaks for itself.
Because it is something interesting that you both brought up there, that when you think of the tabletop RPG, genre is probably the wrong word, but when you think of that kind of bubble, you usually think of the heavy hitters. If you're looking for investigative stuff, as you were saying, Call of Cthulhu, you've also got Dungeons and Dragons, which is definitely something we will be touching on later, I'm sure. And you're right, it seems to be the kind of heavy hitters that have been there for years and years. As versatile as those games can be, you're completely right. There are certain restrictions to these games, especially if you follow the rules to the letter, or even if you want to bend the rules. There's also that question as well. For example, if you were playing a D&D session and you said, oh, I don't want to follow this rule, that rule, which is fine, but if you chuck out 90% of the rules, then you kind of have to ask yourself, well,
are you playing D&D?
Exactly. Thank you for reading my thought there.
If you ask either me or Ash, the answer is no. After you change enough rules, you're not playing D&D anymore, because the rules are what make up the game of D&D. D&D is a big book of rules, and you follow those rules to play D&D.
Well, and maybe whatever game you're playing is better for what you're doing, but in that case, you should get into game design.
Yeah, people trying to turn D&D 5th edition into 1920s noir mystery investigation and failing.
One of the good and, again, slightly problematic things of that is, although Dungeons & Dragons is quite a versatile game in the forefront, at the same time, as you said, it's like, how much can you take out of this before it transforms into something different? As you're both saying, it's like, well, why wouldn't you just create your own game at that point?
Or find one that already does it, someone that's already created.
Out of curiosity, did you do that before you went on to Eureka? Were you trying to, not modify the game, but you know what I mean, try to suit it to your play style before you realised, yeah, we might as well just create a new game?
Oh man, I feel like that's where every designer or contributor to art starts, right? Is in consuming that art and then in thinking, wow, I could do this. Because definitely I've been, just speaking for myself, I've been GMing for like 15 years now, and countless times in the beginning, I just adjust a rule here and there or change things to fit my table. I think it's a very natural start to the process, is modifying what you have in front of you. But just, I think because this medium is, the culture surrounding the medium is such that that isn't recognized as what it is, which is game design. If you're a GM and you're altering the text of the rules, what you're doing is game design. What you're doing is an act of creation, and it's altering the product you have at your table. I don't think that it's understood that you're doing the equivalent of taking a painting and altering it with your own brush, or taking a movie and making an edit of it. It's also an act of creation that changes what you're working with.
No, that's an absolutely fantastic point, though, because, yeah, you're taking the source of this game and then you're just completely changing it, because there's a difference between wanting to change the play style versus, as you were saying before, you changing the fundamental foundation, as it were, of what you're coming into. I have to say, reading through Eureka as this absolutely fantastic game, there is a lot of interesting mechanics that you have brought into it. One of the things that, if you don't mind me bringing it up, is this idea of third-person verbiage. So usually whenever I've personally, maybe except for Warhammer 40k, but then again, who hasn't imagined themselves as a space marine at one point?
Weirdly, a lot of people do play Warhammer 40,000 in first person, and it drives me crazy because I play Warhammer 40,000 and the person across the table is like, I'm going to shoot you for 15 shots at strength 4. I'm like, I've got 16 units on the board, man.
That's true. Warhammer isn't one of those games where it's like, oh, a 1 versus 1. No. It's like, which? especially if you're playing the Imperial Guardsman, then it's an utterly different nightmare. But yeah, usually when you play tabletop RPG games, a lot of players want to go in and they want to be the character that they're going to play this game as, especially with D&D, and I'm assuming the same for Call of Cthulhu. I'm not as knowledgeable for that one, but you know, they want to say, I go into the dungeon or I pick up the clue. But for this game, there is a heavy emphasis, and it's in the book here, that you try to emphasize something called third-person verbiage, which is separating the player from the character. So instead of saying, I go in and I pick up the thing, I would say, my character does X, my character does Y. So out of curiosity, and this again links back to what we were talking about in terms of tabletop culture, but what was the inspiration about going for that rather than first person?
Yeah, I mean, I think we both have a lot to say about this topic.
Oh, go ahead.
So the first thing that I would say is, I mean, it's a struggle to get people to acknowledge the fundamental nature of tabletop games as a medium. And this can really be identified in this assumption of first-person verbiage. At an elemental level, a tabletop game is a conversation, right? It's you talking to people. It's composed of words. It's not just the words in the book, but it's also the words you say at the table during play to describe the world and what's happening. And something so fundamental as the perspective of that narration is not even considered, or other stances to approaching a character. You talked about seeing yourself as inhabiting the role of a character, and that's one stance of play, to borrow a term, actor stance, where you see yourself as an actor inhabiting a role. And that's fine. That's one way to approach things. But there are other ways to approach this topic as well. Other ways to approach this like situation. You could approach it as an author, which is something that is a lot more like what Eureka is doing, is author stance for players. So rather than seeing yourself as an actor inhabiting a role, you see yourself more as almost a writer who is putting a character in a situation and determining what they're going to do based on who they are. It's a more detached point of view. And I think that changes that, and the language changes the emotional impact of the game in a really fundamental way. I've said this before on another podcast, but the difference between first person and third person is that it creates a different feeling and a different emotional response. Like if I say, you know, Alice grabs Bob and kisses him in a passionate embrace, that creates a different emotional space than saying I grab you and I kiss you passionately. I'm not opposed to the idea that there are times where either one is appropriate, but just getting people to acknowledge that the former is an option in a tabletop game is a struggle sometimes, which is just crazy to me.
It didn't used to be.
Yeah, that's true.
If you were in a gaming table like 15 or 20 years ago, you would see pretty often kind of a mix of third person and first person verbiage. Sometimes like, you know, the same person would swap between them, or you'd have, you know, half the tables using third person, half the tables using first person. And in fact, like I think almost every Dungeons and Dragons edition rulebook says that you can use first person or third person, even the recent ones. But in the past 8 to 10 years, third person verbiage for RPGs, which is something that did exist, has been entirely extinct. A big part of that is large budget actual play shows made of people who are literally actors, half pretending to play D&D and always using first person verbiage, and people are learning to play through them and by them. And so often, sometimes without even touching the rulebook, meaning that they learn that this game is played in first person. And like Ash said, it's very hard to get them to acknowledge or think that it could be done any other way.
Do you think that's a big problem though with shows like Critical Role and just in general, these kind of big budget shows that on the one hand, I will say that they have been quite successful in bringing things like Dungeons and Dragons to the mainstream, but on the flip side of that, do you think there's also been a different impact that it's had in the tabletop RPG community as a whole?
The damage they have done is incalculable. And let me reel back that because that's a very exaggerated, extreme statement.
For legal reasons, this is a joke.
Yeah. So we have to talk a bit about how Wizards of the Coast, the makers of Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, 4th edition, and 5th edition, but not the first two, have an absolute monopoly on tabletop RPGs as a artistic medium. In fact, to the point where tabletop RPGs are often just known to people as playing D&D.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of whether it's conscious or not, it is in the interests of Wizards of the Coast to ensure that when people think of tabletop games, they think of D&D and nothing else.
And so Critical Role is just one example. There's a bunch of them that are very big, very popular. So they are a show. It is framed as, let's just get a bunch of friends together to play Dungeons and Dragons and film it, but it's a show. It's got editing. It's got a script. It doesn't have a word for word script. It is very improvisational, but
there are beats.
Yeah, there's beats. Something I like to compare it to is professional wrestling. You know, Hulk Hogan, The Rock. Pro wrestling is scripted. Who wins and who loses, that is part of the script. And there's a few beats that are part of the script. But other than that, they go out and they do a mostly improvised fight. This is not to talk down either, but they're stuntmen. They provide a very exaggerated and melodramatic show about people who fight in a ring, while they themselves are not really fighting in a ring. They're semi-choreographed, scripted stuntmen.
Right. I really like wrestling, and there's a lot of craft to the theatrics of it and to the work of it. I would not denigrate, but you wouldn't look to a professional wrestling match if you were trying to study how to actually fight someone.
Right. What is often happening is that if Critical Role, for example, is professional wrestling, then regular tabletop RPG gameplay is practicing Taekwondo or karate or judo. And those are related, but they are very different skill sets with very different goals and very different best practices. And if you learn all your fighting from Hulk Hogan and then you try to step into the karate dojo, you're not going to be very good at it. And it's going to be detrimental to your experience and to the experience of the instructor and your fellow classmates.
The problem is not that pro wrestling or, Critical Role in this analogy exists and is entertaining to people. The problem is that people are using it as a tutorial. And sure, why shouldn't they to their minds? Because there's no other resource to look to that's like as popular, right? Other than just word of mouth. So you have people watching pro wrestling and going into the dojo and trying to use pro wrestling moves. And when they're told that's not how you do it, that's not how the game actually works, there's a portion of that audience that gets upset about that.
Yes.
No, that is quite an interesting analogy, because ironically enough, one of my fellow co-hosts, Martin McAllister, he's also a wrestler, and he also ran my very first D&D campaign.
Oh, that's awesome.
So if you're listening to this, Martin, big shout out. Yeah, no, those are some absolutely fantastic points, because you're right, there's nothing wrong with enjoying it or consuming the content or whatever, but you're right, as an instructional piece, it is quite interesting how so many people have really tried to emulate, and that is something that I have to say I am really annoyed at, not just in TTRPGs, but also other things where it's like they don't want to be themselves. They want to be the next Matt Mercer or whoever. They want to be the next so-and-so. Again, not to sound like an after-school special to say, be yourself, it's enough. But it's weird how people want to be exactly like that. And one of the examples off the top of my head personally, I remember, was that when my friend Martin said, do you want to play Dungeons and Dragons? Initially, I thought, it still had the stigma at the time. I was like, Dungeons and Dragons, really? That game that everybody makes fun of. But, once you start playing it, you realise, it's actually not that bad. And then I unfortunately ended up in another situation where one of my other friends said, let's play Dungeons and Dragons in this comic shop. And long story short, I've got a whole episode ranting about it, but it was not a good time. It was basically, I thought, it's a starter session because one of my friends wanted to get involved, and the table was really hostile, and it just wasn't a great experience. And I kept thinking, and I still think to this day, if that was my first experience with a tabletop RPG game, especially Dungeons and Dragons, I would never come back to it. Genuinely, if that was my first experience. And that is the danger that I don't think a lot of people really understand, because, and especially in terms of the culture of tabletop RPGs, that they want to be animated and they want to be this and that, and that's fine taking inspiration. But if you're trying to emulate them one for one, then you make the experience bad for someone else. They're not going to return to that hobby,
That's
are
true.
they? Yeah.
This is a discourse that you see even in like mainstream 5e play culture, of GMs feeling like they're expected to be Matt Mercer, or players feeling like they are sitting on the sidelines while a story is told at them. And this kind of also hostile table culture to anything outside of one specific kind of experience, which is super common in public play spaces like a comic shop or a game store, or especially like just playing with a random group it's a total roll of the dice. And I think that a lot of the issues that arise are in part due to a lack of literacy and a lack of respect that this medium has.
That's what a lot of it comes down to, is the medium does not have a lot of respect, even from people who claim to be fans of it. Because if certain people were here, what they'd say to our discussion of saying, well, that's not really the way the game is played. You're trying to do WWE in the karate dojo. It's not going to work very well because it works in a show context, but not in a live sparring context. The goals are fundamentally different. A lot of people would say, well, as long as they're having fun, how can you tell them how to play the game? How can you play Dungeons and Dragons wrong? It's about having fun.
You might very well have fun stacking a bunch of checkers like a Jenga tower, but you aren't playing checkers, are you?
Right. It's a game. It's a structured activity. Maybe you love checker stacking, and you might actually enjoy checker stacking more than the game of regular checkers, but you can't say you're playing checkers. And that's less important than the probably very large amount of people who would either A, rather just be playing unbeknownst to them, they would really enjoy Jenga more than stacking checkers like a Jenga tower, because Jenga blocks are built for stacking and checkers aren't. Or they would have more fun if they were playing checkers correctly. But due to the attitude of, well, you can't tell people they're having fun wrong, you can't tell these people, maybe you'd have more fun if you either played a different game or you played the game you're playing correctly.
To tie that into your bad experience that you had, Satsu, at the comic book store, it also opens the space to say, because you said that if you had had that as your first interaction, you would have never come back. But, you know, it opens the space to say, the table opens up by saying, this is how our group operates. This is how we do things. This is the game we're playing. It's not with the expectation that that's not how every game is. It's like if you see a movie you don't like, it doesn't open the space to say, oh, I must just not like movies. It's, I didn't like that movie.
Do you not think that's quite interesting, though? You make it a fantastic point there that if you watch a film or you play a bad video game, you're not immediately going to go, oh, I'm completely off films now or off TV shows or video games, you know, because it's such a vast medium. But for tabletop RPGs, if you had a bad experience with one of them, then you would say, nah, I'm not coming back to that. It's quite strange, isn't it?
I've got plenty to say on this because it's the monopoly. It's the Wizards of the Coast Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition monopoly, where Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is, due to massive marketing, stands as representative of the whole thing. And it's like, if we make the comparison to video games, this is like if video games were called Skyrims and you're like, oh yeah, I love video games. Then people are like, what? What's that? Oh, it's like Skyrim. And everyone's first video game is then Skyrim. That's the kind of stranglehold that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has on the culture of tabletop RPGs. And I think Skyrim is a very good comparison because we won't get into this, but I don't personally think that Skyrim is a very good game, but it is one that a lot of people enjoy. And it's one that is perhaps most known for its modding, or like highly known for its modding. And there's people that will say, oh, well, Skyrim can be any kind of game because you can just mod it. And that's only a little true, because if you wanted to play Half-Life and you just downloaded mods to replace all the Drog in Skyrim with the Combine soldiers and give guns you can equip, it would look a little bit like Half-Life, but it wouldn't play like Half-Life. And you'd probably have a better time if you played Half-Life 1 or 2, and it would also be easier and crash less.
And I guess that kind of arrives at the heart of the discussion, which is the one point that flies in the face of this monopolistic marketing, which is that game design is real.
Yes.
If you create a product that is different, it creates a different experience. It's a different piece of art. That seems so obvious to say when you say it out loud.
The Wizard of the Coast monopoly is incentivized to get as many people playing Dungeons & Dragons, even people who don't really like what Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is. And get those people playing. They say, Dungeons & Dragons can be anything. You can mod it however you want. Don't look at the games that already do out the box what you want. Play our game and mod it.
But you know, in practice, what that does is say like, oh sure, D&D can be anything. But what that means in practice is everything in this medium is D&D. That's the corollary, which is not true. But that's what it sounds like to someone walking in from the outside. So if they sit down and they don't like a game of D&D, the prevailing culture is to reinforce the idea, well, if you don't like this experience, then you must just not like the medium. If you didn't like the movie Cars, then you don't like movies.
It's an interesting one because I don't know about you both, but when I was growing up and before I started playing D&D and, you know, learning that at least tabletop RPGs weren't as bad as, you know, I was led to believe, but But when I was younger, I remember, and again, it was D&D at the forefront, but it was just these kind of games in general, that they were absolutely ridiculed back in the day. You know, it was for nerdy people, and if you play it, you've got no friends, which is ironic because it is a group game. You know, It was the strangest thing. But then all of a sudden, towards, I want to say, at least the late 2000s and early 2010s, that's when it kind of started to shift. And of course, throughout the 2010s, the reputation of tabletop RPGs definitely got better compared to where it started. But it's, as you were both saying, it's interesting to see, and it's almost like a ship of Theseus situation here, where it's like they're trying to market something that isn't really the original product. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for having a game that everyone, you know, can enjoy, get included in, and so on and so forth. But if you're looking at it from a purely technical standpoint, you're thinking, is this the D&D that everyone began with? Or is it just a bunch of modules that are kind of duct taped together, and if you don't like these ones, you can try this? Because something that I have to say I thought was very unique about Eureka, and I think you actually brought this up in it, that there's not going to be hundreds of modules that you're going to bring out and they're all going to be separated. It's going to be fairly core, that you've got the set amount of rules, you've got the stuff.
Yeah, we weren't planning on writing a bunch of supplements.
Yeah, we're not planning on having the Eureka Player's Handbook, the Eureka Dungeon Master's Guide, the Eureka Player's Handbook 2, 3, 4, 5. We're not planning on doing that. We are planning on having adventure modules, lots of those, but those are, I guess, if you were making the video game comparison a lot, those are like, you know, levels to play, whereas the Eureka rulebook itself is like the game engine.
Yeah, and we don't want to change that around too much or encourage this culture that's like, you have to buy a million supplements to be the most up to date on the rules. If you buy the rules, you should have the rules. Since we're bringing the conversation back around to Eureka, there was something I was curious about, Satsu, which is what brought your attention to Eureka. I've been curious about that.
Well, it must have been Blue Sky, because it might have been you, Addison, that had commented underneath one of my posts, and I have to say, I'm always looking out for whether it's indie games or whether it's tabletop indie games, things like that, because I saw you as well, you were previously on Kickstarter and things, and as soon as I saw it, I was really curious, because, you know, I wanted to obviously talk to you both because you are lovely people, and I'm not just saying that because you're on, but I was looking into it, and the more and more that I read about the game and the more that I delved into what this game was about, what it stood for, I just thought it was a really interesting and almost necessary game. And maybe I'm being a bit dramatic there, but what I mean is, when I was reading it, one of the things that caught my attention as well, and it loosely links to what we were talking about earlier with third-person verbiage, was the idea that you're not only doing that, but you're also tackling player versus character conflict, where it's so easy in these particular games that if you are taking a first person, you're saying, oh, I attack you, and then someone's going to get really offended and take it as a personal attack, say, well, why are you doing this? And that's the emphasis, why are you doing this? And then, of course, you get the age-old argument of, it's what my character would do, which here at Chatsunami, we don't abide by that either. But I thought it was interesting that, again, not only was there that separation, but the fact that it is character versus character, there is that emphasis of, if you want to play it as this character, then you're playing as this character, you're playing a game. This is not a personal attack on people, and it's getting one step ahead that I think does a lot better of a job than a lot of the more mainstream games. As you said, people can choose to be first person or third person, and technically, you know, there's nothing wrong with choosing one or the other, but it doesn't take away that personal touch, if you know what I mean. Personally, I think it's a very important thing that you've addressed in this game, and considering it's one of the first bits of the rulebook, I thought that is absolutely fantastic, because it's not something you really think about with these games. I'm lucky in the sense that because I met my friend and we played together, and I mean, I've played with other friends for other things like 40k and we had a great time. The fact is that because I'm playing with people I know, then at least I can say, oh well, I'm having a great time. Whereas if I was to play the same game with strangers, I probably have more of a risk of not enjoying it. And again, going back to that idea of having a negative perception of it. But the fact that you've basically gone ahead of the player and said, listen, listen, this is the player, this is the character, two separate things, and you're trying to encourage either cooperative behaviour or at the very least limit the conflict. And I think that is just such an important thing. Apologies, that was a long-winded way to say it.
No, thank you.
But no, I think it's just very important for the tabletop community.
Eureka can be an important game in a lot of ways, because a lot of other games just sort of tell you the rules, but they don't tell you how to use the rules. A game will tell you the rules, but doesn't really tell you what the game master is supposed to do with them. And that matters, because that's different for different games. Some games expect a game master to have different duties than other games. The third-person verbiage and like the separation of player and character, I think is also pretty important for Eureka, because Eureka is a game that can get pretty nasty.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
It can get pretty nasty, and it doesn't want to be a purely cooperative experience. I mean, arguably, as long as the players are all having fun, they are cooperating, but the characters do not have to cooperate. The characters can go against each other, and that's something that's completely alien to a lot of people who have a more shallow perception of tabletop RPGs.
There's a lot of these concepts in Eureka that are very different to the mainstream. I won't say that all of them are completely unique. Certainly there are other games that have attempted one thing or the other, but holistically, to use a term coined by a good friend of ours, it's very glebe-lore. It's very alien. There's a lot of concepts that just are not taken as a default assumption. And yeah, one of those is like the separation of player and character and the idea of a non-cooperative party of investigators and the idea of third-person verbiage. I think we're both very flattered, by the way, that you said that it was an important game. I agree that it's important to establish this separation up front, particularly in a game like Eureka, because one of the things that it's also doing that we wanted to do with Eureka was make it clear that the medium can accommodate other kinds of stories and other kinds of character interactions than just cooperative, and can get dark and pretty horrific in tone. And one of the things that we really want to avoid is people transplanting this character who does awful things in the course of the story to their friend across the table who is playing that character. But I think that the medium can handle those kinds of stories, and I think it should, because that's the root of horror, right? Is like challenging our preconceived notions and shocking us and scaring us. And while I won't say that Eureka is always a horror-focused game, it frequently is.
Because one of the interesting things that I read in the guidebook was that it doesn't always have to be, uber serious. And I mean, don't get me wrong, as you said, there's a lot in there to craft a game like that, but there's also, if you wanted, there's also a lot of Scooby-Doo-ness as well.
Yes.
And I love that about it, that if you wanted to introduce someone to the world of tabletop RPGs and, you didn't want to say, oh, right, there's a dead body in the middle of the floor and white graphic and whatnot, you could just say, okay, there's a guy with a mask running around, let's go catch him. And I think that's important as well, that idea of accessibility, that if you wanted to change that story but still keep the core mechanics, because that is something that's quite interesting, that if you're changing certain things about other tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, there has to be a lot of tweaking of the mechanics, as it were. Although the tone can change, it depends how much you're plucking away in order to both accommodate and keep the core of the game. But I just thought that was absolutely fantastic, that you can have a more light-hearted version of Eureka, or if you want to go for, the darker tone, as you were saying, then it's there, it's available. And I'm not going to read through them all, but you've got a long list of creatures and things like that, of course, you can encounter through the game. So it's absolutely incredible, and it is very versatile in that regard.
It's kind of like real life, because in real life, you could have a goofy guy with a mask going around. Eureka has rules for getting chased by a goofy guy with a mask. It also has rules for characters getting shot with guns, quite extensive ones, that are very punishing and intense, just like in real life, because in real life, you could get shot with a gun, and it would be very punishing and intense.
Yeah, I mean, I do appreciate the versatility of Eureka, because we have created a toolkit system to a degree. Even so, it's opinionated, I guess, on how the rules of the game are going to impact the tone of the story. You said earlier that there's that versatility there, and I guess that's the point in adventure modules. We kind of want the modules to be like a library of different stories that can be told using the game engine Eureka.
Like different levels.
Yeah, but I also appreciate that versatility. I like the Scooby-Doo goofiness that Eureka can bring around. I mean, sometimes even in the same adventure, that it then turns around and becomes some of the most deeply horrifying stuff I've ever seen in a tabletop game, honestly.
Well, what about games being opinionated? That's the topic to talk about.
Sure.
That's something we've kind of been talking about on and off the whole time and barely talked about Eureka.
Yeah. Because Eureka is opinionated no matter what you do with it.
Yeah, and all games are. All tabletop RPGs are opinionated.
They are.
Eureka is just one that sort of states its opinions out loud. And I don't mean that I have opinions and I'm the writer of Eureka. That is true, but that's not what I'm talking about. Because, all right, let's take Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Dungeons & Dragons, if you look at a Dungeons & Dragons character sheet, you look at the rules, which not every Dungeons & Dragons player has. About 90% of the information on that character sheet is combat information. And there's not a lot of rules for interacting in a non-combat sense. And also experience points are given for defeating monsters in combat. The lists of items that your character can have and equip are mostly about combat, and some of them are about exploring a dungeon or a forest or some other dangerous place where you would get into a lot of combat. And that means that the game is opinionated. And if you play the game by the rules, your characters are probably going to get into a lot of combat. And if you make characters that are pacifists, you can still technically try to play it, but you will quickly run into you and the rules are going to clash and run into an impasse.
I mean, I would say in the case of 5th edition, it's almost that the game really has very little to say about what a character can do outside of those specific circumstances.
And that's not bad. That's not a bad thing.
Oh, no, it's not.
Because Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition's combat, despite being the main part of the game that the game both funnels characters towards and, is opinionated about, it's not very good.
I do personally find it boring, but
this is also like we talked about where people come away from a bad session and think, oh, they just don't like tabletop RPGs. Very common that people come away from Dungeons & Dragons and say, I don't like combat in tabletop RPGs because they've only played a game that A, has lots of combat if you play it right, and B, the combat is not very well designed.
I would argue that one of the other big problems is that it's just not really integrated into the gameplay, like into the way that it operates. Because, 5th edition says somewhere in its rulebook that like there are 3 pillars of D&D or whatever. It's combat, it's exploration. I know it says exploration is one of the pillars, but what rules are there for exploration? It's not meaningfully supported. And what this means is that combat ends up feeling like a totally separate mini game and not the thing that the game is about. It ends up feeling tertiary in a game whose design language makes it primary.
So because the game is opinionated, so if you try to make a bunch of pacifist characters who don't get into combat, then you can try to do it, but you'll quickly run into a clash with the rules where they get into a situation. And what are the options there? The options are either A, use the sword that everyone has and the magic spells that blow things up and the combat battle abilities, or B, try to resolve that in a non-combat way for which there are very little abilities or rules.
There's a perfunctory stapled on roll.
And many people think that's a good thing and are kind of praise Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition for that, and then they do it. But at that point, if you're not engaging with the rules and you're going off rules to completely freeformly do this, then maybe you shouldn't play Dungeons & Dragons. You should do some freeform roleplay if you're not going to engage with 90% of the rules.
Or you should play a game which actively seeds that portion of play on purpose, like Mothership.
Yeah, and both encourages and supports characters that are pacifists and don't get into combat. And that's an example of a game being opinionated. But Wizards of the Coast, and through their marketing, Critical Role being an arm of which, really want you to not learn and not know that games are opinionated so that you'll play Dungeons & Dragons whether you like it or not, essentially.
Well, because that means that D&D can be anything.
Yeah, they say D&D can be anything so that people that want anything will go to D&D and never leave it.
And Eureka is opinionated too. And this is a good thing. As you're always saying, Addison, the rules in a rulebook are the wind behind the sails. They're what make the game happen. The fact that Eureka is opinionated about time is going to pass in a pretty granular way and at like a certain pace, and is pretty opinionated about the fact that all of these investigators, they're not fearless people. They can be rattled, they can be shaken, they can lose their nerve. And it's opinionated about the fact that these people are not police officers or have any structural power.
Even just the skills.
Yeah, it's opinionated about what skills are the default.
A character from Eureka walks into a room and sees anything in the room. How can they interact with it?
Right.
They can interact with it with those skills that are on the character sheet.
And those are a specific set of skills. They aren't everything that's available in theory.
Yeah, those are the abilities of a Eureka character, is those 21 skills on the character character sheet, plus maybe it's more complicated, plus traits, plus write-in skills, etc. But those are their abilities, and therefore, if you're engaging in trying to play the game instead of just doing free-form roleplay, and I don't have a problem with free-form roleplay, but I think that it's just a different activity from playing a tabletop RPG, because the tabletop RPG is the rules, and if you're not engaging with the rules, are you engaging with the game? Those skills on the character sheet, those will partially, but not entirely, if it was a video game, they would entirely dictate it, but because it's a tabletop RPG, they partially dictate what the character can do, and therefore what the character will do. And every other rule also does that, because the fact that Eureka characters have 5 penetrative hit points and a gun takes away, getting shot by a gun takes away 4 penetrative hit points, they are going to get real scared when the gun is pointed at them, as opposed to a more action-focused Rambo badass tabletop RPG where characters have lots of hit points and bullets and they just shrug off bullets.
All of those opinions that the system has are going to impact any story told using the engine, whether it be a serious crime drama or a paranormal horror thriller or a goofy Scooby-Doo-esque whodunit.
And honestly, that is just such a great approach for it. I was actually just thinking there when you were talking about D&D being a very combat heavy, at least for the latest module, that I remember when I was playing it ages ago, and I think we were playing 3.5 edition. My friend had said, every week, why don't we have a guest DM? And by that, we kind of rotated just for a while. And I remember one of our friends who, he had this story planned, but there was only a certain amount of time that we all had that we could do it, and he only got halfway through because the majority, he had a big battle at the beginning or a fight against some guards, but he completely overestimated how powerful they were, but they were going back and forth between us, the players, and them, the NPCs, and it's something that I think a lot of people don't really, at least especially for D&D, they don't really know how to judge how strong certain elements in terms of the combat should be, because I think it was you saying, Ash, that it can get quite dull and boring if it goes on and on and on, and you're completely right there. If it's just the same kind of repetitive, I swing the sword, or my character swings the sword, and then it's just back and forth and you're both missing one another, that's not as interesting as maybe what you're thinking in your head of, oh, they're clashing swords and they're doing this and they're throwing energy balls. But for Eureka, it definitely seems a lot more grounded, that you're in a world where, although it's relatively similar to ours, it is at the same time got these elements that the characters have to think, where am I going to go with this? It makes sense, the character's not going to walk into a room and be like, oh, that's a gun, that's fine, I've got 10 points that I can take for damage. The character's not going to think like that. It's going to be a lot more careful, and I think from a player perspective as well, it allows them to slow down a little bit, because, and again, going back to that very bad experience I had with D&D, there was a guy on the table who played as, I want to say, a ranger, but honestly I was just raging. He would rush into every situation, like he would be saying, oh, I'm going to grab this ruby, and then his hand would get taken off by this trap, and then he would keep going on and on and on, and the first, 1 or 2 times you went, oh, haha, polite laugh. But the more and more it went on, and he did this for a good 5 to 10 minutes, and I think he had a feat that allowed him second wind. And that's the thing though, it's like you sit there and you listen to this person clearly know that they've got all of these hit points of damage, thinking, oh, I'm not immortal, but oh, I've got enough to spare.
Their ranger has all these hit points or whatever.
Yeah. Again, when you look at Eureka, it's not really the same mindset that you would take in, but at the same time, you wouldn't really want to take a D&D mindset, or even a Call of Cthulhu or Gumshoe or anything like that. You wouldn't really want to take that in. You want to create a character, again, whether they're a gruff detective or, as we said, an extra in Scooby-Doo kind of thing. The players will want to create a character and then put a character into this situation, and then the character then forges their own story within the world of Eureka, rather than thinking, that it's going to be just, you're going to tank bullets. And what I'm saying is, it's well thought out. I'm not saying that D&D isn't well thought out, but it's a lot more clear, if that makes sense, what you're expecting going into Eureka.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that has to do with setting expectations, right? Because because it creates a different tone. Because, yeah, this is a difference in like what the character is thinking and what the player is thinking. The character walks into a room and sees someone pointing a gun at them, and the character thinks, oh my God, I'm having a gun pointed at me. This is a really dangerous situation. And maybe in another game, you have the player thinking, well, my guy can take like a bunch of bullets, so I don't really care. One of the goals with Eureka specifically is to create a really grounded feel. So to that end, you have to kind of bring those expectations in harmony. If you want a character to feel intimidated by a gun within the fiction, then it helps that in a tabletop RPG to have the player look at the character sheet and think, oh, it's going to be a real problem if my guy gets hit.
I was going to say, if you look at something like Warhammer 40k, you technically don't feel the same way, but then I remembered that, you know, when you play Eureka, you don't think that the character is an 8-foot super soldier from space. Yeah, I think that would change Eureka significantly, and I doubt you're going to create an extension that's going to have super soldiers like that. But again, no, for legal reasons, that's a joke. I'm looking at the red panda lawyer in the corner, and yeah, he's nodded his head, giving the thumbs up, so yeah, definitely a joke.
If we were going to create a game where investigators were big, muscly warriors from space who could take a bunch of bullets, then we would have made a different set of rules.
See, to be honest, if you did, I think Games Workshop probably would be quaking in their boots right now. They're just watching as if, I wonder what this Eureka team is up to this time.
Take over the market.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with Eureka, you probably could with a different game. Not that I'm saying you should, because you've got more than enough on your plate with this game, but I honestly think that, and again, I joked about it before, but I genuinely think that this is quite both an interesting and probably quite a good start for anybody who is trying to get into tabletop RPGs. It's going back to something that Addison, I think you said at the very beginning, where you've got Wizards of the Coast who have quite a monopoly, and then on the other side, if you're looking for the combat side, Games Workshop is there with the big bolter gun pointing at people. But it's quite good to see that there's more people breaking into this space now, because if you think about, and again, 20, 30 years ago, probably even longer ago, that you have these companies that made it obviously to create revenue and money and things and get players involved, but you know, you didn't really have many or as many independent game makers coming into the scene. And it's the same with video games as well, because I have to say, the older I get, the more I think that I prefer playing indie games, that these are games that people have spent their time and their artistic merit creating and things, and they've got a clear vision. And I swear to goodness, I don't mean to sound like a hipster when I say that, but you know, it does definitely feel a lot more, it feels a lot more interesting to see the stories and the mechanics that they are creating as opposed to what's going on in mainstream games. Again, I think it's very similar here, that I think not only is it a great starting point for people wanting to get into tabletop roleplay games, but it's also great to see the both of you and your whole team as a whole. So if your whole team are listening, I do want to shout them out as well, that you've created something absolutely fantastic here, and it is great to see that you've had that opportunity, you know, to bring Eureka to life. And I know I'm not the only one who probably thinks that, because, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, because I did have a wee peek at the comments that your game got, and I have to say, they're all majoritively positive, aren't they?
Yeah, thank you so much. We do have some other stuff that we're working on as well in the wings. We're trying to push Eureka down the path towards a physical release. Just a note to any new designers out there, oh my God, don't attempt something this huge. If you are doing a first project, we have bitten off so much more than we can chew, and it's a miracle that we are, you know, able to pursue it as much as we have. But once Eureka does come out, we do have some other stuff coming down the pipeline, like Silk and Dagger, if you wanted to say a word or two about that, Addison.
Way to put me on the spot, because Silk and Dagger is a completely unmarketable game, and it really takes to even come up with what to put on the store page for it.
Maybe I can have a shot.
You have a shot at what Silk and Dagger is.
It's a social politics / comedy game about about I guess an exaggerated or like a deconstructed version of Forgotten Realms Drow, taking a different interpretation on that and setting up a society with them where the Drow and several other lower caste servant dark elves are participating to try and basically avoid embarrassment and political scandal in a scenario that I could best compare to like Faulty Towers.
That does sound incredible, I'm not going to lie.
It's very, very early in development, but we're not just doing mystery games.
We're releasing the alpha version of Silk and Dagger. I don't know when this episode is going to be released, but at the time of recording, it's March 5th, and the alpha version is going to be released on Itch.io March 10th. Of course, this is an alpha. It will not be as finished or polished as Eureka, which we consider to be in beta now. The game is finished. We're just going through and editing, fixing bugs, and polishing.
Yeah, that's still what we're spending the majority of our time on.
Yeah, but because Eureka is at such a finished point that I, the lead writer, I've lead written everything that I'm going to write on Eureka. So during my time, quote unquote, clocked in, I've started bringing some of our other games from napkin notes to something that's almost playable. Silk and Dagger will be playable. We're releasing it when it's at the bare minimum of playability. And of course, its payment is optional and development is ongoing. It's a bit like on Steam, you'd have early access where you can pay for it, and we're still working on it.
And if anyone listening, by the way, is wanting to get into either, wanting to look at Eureka, get involved with the community, whatever you like, right now, the beta version of Eureka is pay what you want on itch.io. So you can look up Eureka Investigative Urban Fantasy. You'll be able to find it no problem. Silk and Dagger will be coming out, and I believe will also be pay what you want. And we have a Discord server, the NMRPG Book Club. I'm sure we can send you a link, Satsu. If you want to put it in the description, you're welcome to, which we play lots of indie games. Right now we're doing Eureka, and it may come up again in the future, but we do lots of indie games there. We have our Patreon server, all kinds of stuff to get involved. We try to make it as easy of an entry as you can, and we would love to see you there.
Yeah, and also for anyone who is looking to start creating tabletop RPGs, like Ash said, don't do something as big as Eureka in the same, I don't really like this term, but it's a term that gets thrown around a lot and kind of describes Eureka, is simulationist. You should probably do something a bit smaller and in a style that is a bit less dense and heavy for your first thing, and definitely not if you're just one person. But also you have to, first of all, read and play a lot of tabletop RPGs. Can't just be you've played 6 sessions of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Can't just be, oh, you've played 8 years of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you've played only one game, you can't make a new game. Would you go and watch a movie that was directed by a director that has only seen one movie, even if it was a good movie? No, you wouldn't. You have to experience a lot of examples of the art form and also really experience them, not just set the rulebook on the table, barely open it, and just go by vibes and fudge the dice rolls, ignore the rules so that things don't happen exactly the way you want them to. You got to play those games and you got to find out how those rules affect the gameplay and understand that. You got to learn how dice probability works. And I see lots of indie games that will be like, oh, roll 2 6-sided dice, and they'll give you their results from 1 to 12. It's like, how did you look at the probability on this? Did you know that you can't roll a 1 with 2 6-sided dice?
Yeah, a lot of these fundamentals.
You got to understand that Eureka is different from something like Monster of the Week in not just in how its rules are different, but how its opinions and the way it wants to be played are different. And it's something that's kind of hard to put into words. I'm not satisfied with any of the other ways that other people have put it into words, but I don't have a perfect solution myself. But those are very different styles of games, and they expect the player to take the rules, even though the rules are already different. They expect the player to take the rules in a very different way, and for the game master to take the rules in a very different way and apply them in a very different way. You got to understand that, and you have to know how you want your game's rules to be applied and what kind of gameplay will result from those game rules.
You have to know what the art form can do and what the tools you're working with can do, just like a filmmaker has to know what a camera can do. And none of this, some of it may sound harsh, but none of that is to say that you shouldn't get involved with playing RPGs or with writing them, or that it's some elite skill that requires a special kind of person. Rather, it's an invitation to engage. We want you here. We want you in the medium. Please join us.
We want you to really be here.
Right.
We don't want you to, all right, we want, if we're making it like a movie theater, we want you to go go in, sit down, and watch the movie all the way through and form your opinions on it. We don't want you to sort of sit around at the entrance on your phone and kind of listen to the movie. We want you to engage so that you can appreciate the movie. And if we're movie makers, we want you to appreciate our hard work and have a good time with our movie.
So please come join us, because we'd love to talk to you about it and we'd love to see what you make.
Yeah.
And honestly, I feel as if that's the perfect point to wrap up this episode, because honestly, you're both absolutely incredible. So is your team for creating this game and getting this far. So first of all, thank you so much for coming on to this episode and really just discussing your passion on tabletop RPGs, because it is clear that you both are absolutely passionate about this topic. Second of all, before we wrap up, where can these lovely listeners at home both find your content? Where can they find you on social media, and where can they find the game, most importantly?
Thanks for having us, Satsu.
Yes, also thank you for bringing us on. This has been a very nice discussion. If anyone wants to just use a search engine, if you just Google search Eureka Investigative Urban Fantasy, that should pull up our itch.io page. And you can find us on Tumblr and on Blue Sky for social media under the name anim-TTRPGs on both. And we do have a Patreon. I believe you have to search Agency of Narrative Intrigue and Mystery Patreon to find that. We also have...
And a Ko-fi and stuff.
We have a Ko-fi as well. The Patreon, you get basically more frequent and earlier updates as we work on finishing all our stuff, as well as hang out with us in the Patreon Discord server where we have play tests. You can play those games with us because we play test them there.
We very frequently take ideas from that server and talk to people in that server about what ought to be done and what direction something ought to go.
Yeah. Then we also have the book club, the Tabletop RPG book club Discord server, which is a much larger server. That one you don't need. That one's completely free, where you come and you can talk about tabletop RPGs, talk to a lot of people who are very, very passionate and knowledgeable about tabletop RPGs, and they can find you the games that you really want to play. If you're like, oh, I've only played Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, where do I go? What do I do if I want to play something else? There's a million games, and I don't know which one I'd like. Which game should be the game I play instead? Well, first of all, you shouldn't just play one game. You don't play one video game. I mean, most people don't. If you play video games, you play a variety of them, and you hate some of them and you love some of them. But the people in that server will be able to tell you based on what you enjoy about tabletop RPGs or think you enjoy, because again, a lot of people have only had the very slightest brush with the concept of playing it. Even if you've been playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition nominally for years, you know,
you'll be able to find what you're looking for.
You'll be able to find what you're looking for. Plus, we also play games there. We have the main book club where people nominate what game they want to play, then everyone votes on the nominations, and then we sort people into groups based on their schedule compatibility. Then we have an organized play session or various organized play sessions based on schedules. And people, they sort off in their own groups, they play the game, and then they come back and we discuss it like a book club. But there's also just channels specifically for finding basically just, hey, I want to run Call of Cthulhu with this adventure module. Who wants to join? Can you join it at 4 p.m. on Friday to start? We'll make characters. It's a great place for you to dive deeper into the world of tabletop RPGs and become someone who plays lots of tabletop RPGs instead of being like a video gamer who only plays Skyrim.
We hope to see you there.
I just want to reiterate for the lovely Pandalorians listening at home, seriously, go check out this game. It is such a fascinating tabletop RPG, and I know a lot of you out there listening to this, you are into tabletop RPGs, so yeah, go check out Eureka. But if you would like further episodes from ourselves, then you can check us out at our website, chatsunami.com, as well as all good podcast apps. I also want to thank our amazing Pandalorian patrons who have supported us: Robotic Battle Toaster, Sonia, Ghostie, and Cryptic1991. Thank you so much for supporting the show. And if you would like early access, exclusive episodes, commentary tracks, me rambling some more, which of course is a classic, then of course you can catch us at our Patreon page, patreon.com/Chatsunami. This podcast is a member of the Podpack Collective. For further information, please check out our Twitter/X handle, Podpack Collect. But until next time, thank you all so much for listening. Stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, stay hydrated.